Convido então a professora Miriam Pilar Grossi para apresentar a conferencista dessa noite. Convido também a professora Sarah Schulman, da City University of New York, para compor a mesa.
É com uma grande satisfação que nós vamos agora dar início à última etapa desse nosso Fazendo Gênero 10. Eu queria apresentar, então, a professora Sarah Schulman, que atua no Departamento de Inglês como professora de Humanidades no College of Staten Island, na City University of New York, a CUNY. Como ativista lésbica, Sarah Schulman participou de vários grupos nos Estados Unidos, do ACT UP em Nova York, coordenando o ACT UP Oral History Project, do grupo Lésbicas Vingadoras e das Caminhadas Lésbicas, as Dyke Marchs. Várias de suas peças teatrais foram montadas no circuito teatral norte-americano. Sarah, que é judia, foi coordenadora da primeira delegação LGBT norte-americana Palestina, cuja experiência e análise sustentou seu mais recente livro, Israel-Palestina e o Queer Internacional. Entre suas principais obras destacamos A Gentrificação da Mente, Testemunha de um Imaginário Perdido, Laços que Sufocam, Homofobia Familiar e as Suas Consequências, Teatro, AIDS e Marketing Gay nos Estados Unidos e Minha História Americana, Vida Gay e Lésbica durante os anos Reagan e Bush. Além do seu importante artigo Homofobia Familiar, uma experiência em busca de reconhecimento, publicada pela revista Bagoas brasileira, o seu único livro traduzido em português é o romance ensaístico Boemia dos Ratos, em que descreve de maneira devastadora como as pessoas LGBT são abandonadas por suas famílias e as formas criativas que encontram para novos laços afetivos. Nós vamos escutar, então, agora a conferência da professora Sarah, intitulada Desafios do Feminismo, Amigos, diante da Família, Sociedade, diante do Governo. Peço a salva de palmas para recebê-la.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Felipe Bruno, my intrepid host. Okay. Thank you all so much for inviting me. It's an incredible honor to be here. It's my first time in Brazil, and I want to share with you some of my experiences and insights on where we are now. Now, the given theme is the challenge of feminism, and I have to ask myself, what isn't the challenge of feminism? Not only are we talking about how women live and feel, but we're also now using the word to mean a value system, a way of doing things. So, when we look at the materiality of women's lives across the globe, we see a continued exclusion from power, but also, when we look at human methodology in general, we see an eclipse of justice from the governmental to the personal. So in the long period of preparation for this talk, I decided that I wanted to focus on the very dramatic transformations in the gay, LGBT, or queer movement, however you want to think of it, and its relationship to feminism. How concepts and self-concepts have evolved that eclipse feminism, a system rooted in justice, equal opportunity, access, and the value of the individual and the community. Now, some of these ideas are already in circulation, and some are new, some are solid, and some are tentative, and I'm grateful in advance for your attention and very much look forward to our discussion. So in short, I want to show that as the LGBT movement has moved away from feminism. It has moved towards nationalism and the state. And that organic to this is the manipulation of the politics of fear, which is a trope familiar from the experience of other groups as they have morphed from pervasive oppression to selective dominance. Now, there was a time that is not long past when queer people were at the bottom of every society. I'm 55 years old, and perhaps some of you here also remember when globally all queer people lived in illegality. Certainly, it was my generation that was trampled by the mass death experience of AIDS, a historic cataclysm caused by government indifference and neglect. And some of you are living in countries today where this epidemic continues unabated because of a lack of political will for all human beings to have equal access to the standard of care treatments. These treatments were forced into existence by the AIDS activist movements of the 1980s and 90s, in which despised groups of people with no rights, abandoned by their families and governments and facing a terminal disease, joined together to force their societies to change against their will, thereby saving each other's lives. But even though this fiercely unprecedented cross-class, cross-gender, and interracial movement succeeded in forcing the creation of effective treatment, they could not transform the global class system. And so today, people continue to suffer from HIV disease when that is completely unnecessary. Yet, I think we all understand that the initial government inaction in the West was rooted in the idea that the affected communities, the poor and the queer, did not merit the protection of their governments and did not deserve to live. We did not have citizenship. Now, while many queer people everywhere today continue to face profound danger from their governments, their families, their entertainment, media, propaganda systems, we also have a new phenomena in which, at the same time, increasing elements of the global queer community are gaining enough rights to bring them to equity with straight people of their same race and class positions. And I think this is the right moment to examine the consequences of the inequitable shift towards equity. For we will find that, just as with people with AIDS, the access remains constrained by class and race and gender, so that solutions long desired and fought for by diverse people are creating profoundly inequitable conditions that worsen the lives of some of us while transforming the values of those with access. So let's start with why we did this. Why was there a gay movement in the first place? Now, if we go back many years, we find the gay liberation movement. The word liberation was chosen. It was the 1960s, and all over the world there were liberation movements. There were liberation movements against colonialism, against imperialism. And by choosing the words gay liberation movement, they put themselves in relationship to these other movements. And of course, at the same time, there was the Black liberation movement and the women's liberation movement. The goals of these liberation movements were social transformation. We wanted a world in which sexuality, gender, and emotional structures were open and individual, and not punished by the state, nor enforced by the state. In 1981, the AIDS crisis changed this in many ways. Most importantly, the sudden, uncontrollable visibility of hundreds of thousands of people dying, often in the streets, made the active denial of homosexuality impossible to maintain. The mainstream media was forced to acknowledge the existence of homosexuality and was thereby confronted with the radical movements like ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, doing actions like disrupting Mass with 7,000 people at St. Patrick's Cathedral. This caused the media to need to produce the kind of homosexual who they could represent that would not be out of the box of the status quo. So starting in the early 1990s, the media began to construct its own fake public homosexuality, where they selected and promoted media spokespeople who were not from the grassroots, and instead opposed the politics of gay liberation. In this way, gay liberation through the venue of mainstream media was replaced by gay rights. Gay rights being a movement with the opposite objective of gay liberation. Gay rights was a tolerance movement rooted in legal containment, in which gay people sought equal rights for all the ways that our lives were recognizable and familiar to the heterosexual majority, and abandoned the arenas of difference. There was a profound psychological element of trauma in this transition as well, for the community was devastated by the mass death and suffering of its members, and equally, I think, devastated by the wholesale abandonment of these suffering and dying people by their governments and families. So the transformation from liberation to rights was partially an expression of AIDS trauma, of fear for survival, and the conscious and unconscious desire for protective assimilation. In this period, corporations who had been forced to notice queer people through the visibility of AIDS now began to cynically niche market to them. What began as mainstream marketing campaigns for AIDS drugs became structures then used by named products as marketers learned that LGBT people were the most brand loyal consumers in America. Our families didn't care if we lived or died, our governments didn't care if we lived or died, but Absolute Vodka wanted us, and we were so grateful. In this way, a significant change was made in which the gay movement no longer was about transforming society. It had become about society transforming us. As the legalistic gay rights agenda proceeded, and as different kinds of gay rights and different degrees of gay rights started to be enacted in specific countries or cities or districts, a new process began, one in which some elements of the LGBT community were granted access to the state apparatus, to the police, and to the power of punishment and enforcement against the other elements of the LGBT community who still can't access those forces. And so we've seen ourselves move from a community in which everyone was in illegality, in which we were at the bottom of every society, to one in which some of us, as openly queer people, now have the power of the dominant group in profoundly unjust societies. And interestingly, deeply embedded in these gross inequalities is the politics of fear, trauma, and safety. Now, as I see it, the three main arenas in which this access to the punishment of the state are granted to openly queer people are HIV criminalization, queer pro-family politics, and queer citizenship. So let's start with the question of citizenship. And we can use the term here coined by Rutgers professor Jasbir Puar, homo-nationalism. Now, in some places in the world, homophobia was the only thing keeping some gay people from full dominant cultural privileges in unequal societies. This is particularly evident in Western European countries where white gay people are given absolutely the same equal access as white straight people, and they start to participate as openly gay people in racial and religious supremacy systems that might have previously excluded them because of homophobia. In the Netherlands, for example, we're seeing increasing numbers of white Dutch queer people joining right-wing anti-immigrant groups. Some of these are focused on Christian supremacy against Muslims, knowing full well, of course, that there are queer people within the refugee and immigrant communities and within the Muslim communities. Similarly, in Britain, we see groups like the racist English Defence League having an open LGBT column. In Israel, we see Jewish LGBT movements often in complicity with the occupation of Palestine and apartheid-like discrepancies in legal rights. In fact, with the exception of China, almost all secular right-wing movements no longer oppose gay rights. Really, the only opposition to gay rights in the world today is religious. So we're seeing that racist movements committed to using their citizenship to access the government to punish or hurt immigrants, refugees, occupied people, Muslims, now include openly queer people on both sides of the equation. In the United States, for example, the repudiation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell offered LGBT people citizenship, That is to say, the right to serve openly in the military in exchange for participating in immoral and illegal wars against Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we're seeing a trend in the West where LGBT people are offered full, openly gay citizenship that allows them to exclude, punish, and even kill others with the full cooperation and encouragement of the state. So that is one new division in the queer community between access to the state apparatus for punishment and being on the receiving end of that punishment, in this case between citizens and non-citizens. And in these cases, the people in the dominant cultural position, the ones who can hurt, use the argument of fear. They are afraid. They are afraid of immigrants, of refugees, of foreign workers. They're afraid of Muslims, of Arabs, of Palestinians. They're afraid of terrorists. And they use this as justification for using the state apparatus to shun and punish with violence, incarceration, and expulsion. Now, before we continue, let us pause for a moment to engage this concept of the politics of fear. We're a privileged group, and it has to be a group pathology, a mob, because individuals cannot punish in the way that bullying groups can. Where a dominant group can say they are afraid in order to gang up on or punish people who are actually the ones in danger. Now, there's the Trayvon Martin case. Are you familiar with this case? A little bit? The Trayvon Martin case in Florida in the United States is the most blatant example of the abuse of the politics of being afraid. The murderer, George Zimmerman, was afraid of black people. He felt endangered, and as a result, he murdered an unarmed black man in what the killer felt was self-defense. The state enabled this because they found him innocent. The pathological anxiety in which the perpetrator saw himself as the victim was enabled by his community in conjunction with the state to retain that self-image. What the state and community did not provide was a way to help him calm down, a social structure of intervention so that he would not act out on his anxieties, but would instead learn how to name them. His friends and family and state did not help him learn how to say, I feel triggered. I feel out of control rage. I feel compelled to do destructive things. Instead, it reinforced his anxiety and false reality and his punitive actions as though they were reasonable. Now, similarly, for those of us involved in Israel-Palestine, we hear the same arguments. The Israelis say they are afraid, and therefore the dehumanization of Palestinians is justified. When anxious people say they are afraid, they become exempt from the need to negotiate. Now, not every person has this right, of course. Based on race, class, and gender, some people can access this state sanction and some cannot. But sometimes it's a subcultural right. Punishment becomes a community right on the model of the law. Sometimes within a group, being afraid is justification for causing pain, and sometimes the state agrees. Now, those of us who have become dominant but still feel powerless continue to use this trope to repress others. Yeah, but I have rewritten this, so this is a little bit different than what I'm just explaining. Okay, so I'm sure you figured out that what I'm saying is not exactly what you're reading, right? Okay, so if your English is with me, then you can listen, and if you're reading in the Portuguese, then you read the text. Okay? How many people are following me in English? Okay, some. Okay, good. And how many people are reading in Portuguese? Everybody else. Everyone who didn't understand what I just said. Okay. Okay. What I'm saying now is that just because you feel this way, ready? Just because you feel afraid doesn't mean you are in danger. And the more power you have, the more you feel afraid of people who don't have power. Right? Because they want equality and they want to take your power away from you. So then we're afraid. So then now, some of us gay people, we can call the state and say, I'm afraid. I'm afraid of this refugee. I'm afraid of this immigrant. I'm afraid of this Palestinian. I'm afraid of this person. Come on, state, hurt them. Now, there are some openly gay people who have this power. So that since this is a conference about feminism, let's talk about what are feminist values. And I want to say that change is made on a governmental level in the same way that it's made on a personal level. Just change is made when all people are taken into account. Injustice is by definition only based on one person's experience. So if only the people with power are deciding what is just, you have injustice, right? I think the best known debate around this is about hate crimes and hate speech. Because we who were once victimized by the state now have access to the state to restrict the speech of others and to punish them for expressing ideas that we don't want them to have. But the more state power queer people can access, the broader the implications of this power. As feminists, we believe that all human beings, by virtue of being born, deserve care and opportunity and equal access. It's our responsibility to understand what dynamics constitute harm. Our job is harm reduction in the broadest sense. And inherent in this objective is the knowledge that all human beings deserve to be heard and considered, whether they are citizens or not. Similarly, we should ask the same thing about families. The greatest challenge to feminism has always been and continues to be Okay. Okay. As feminists, I would say that historically the greatest challenge to feminism has always been and continues to be the family. And the fact that a family is queer does not exempt it from this truth. As pro-family ideology has come to dominate queer communities, we're quickly forgetting everything we ever learned about family when we were still feminists and looking at how institutions affect women. What of the politics of protectionism or of fear in an environment where the queer community is now dominated by pro-family and pro-natalist politics, and at the same time has more access to and comfort with the state, the law, and official modes of enforcement and punishment? With this shift towards dominance comes a new relationship with the government, for the family has a relationship with the state that an individual does not have. Families and governments share the law and the power of enforcement, which individuals and communities do not. As some queers feel increasingly normal, they feel more identified with the state and are more willing to call on the state to punish on their behalf. The discourse of safety, danger, and protection can increasingly be a place of intersection of the state and the family against the individual. What happens when families are corrupt? What happens when family systems inflate the power of some members and destroy the lives of others? Who is responsible then? Who is accountable? Whose job is it to intervene? The more power and centrality the family has in queer life, the more the consequence dysfunctional family systems have on the broader community. It is now time for an overt conversation about the responsibility of queer friends in response to family systems that are corrupt, or as we politely call it, dysfunctional. This is a hugely complex conversation that I can only introduce in a preliminary way tonight, because the coming together of the family, the state, and the politics of protection brings us truly crucial questions about anxiety, fear, trauma, projection, and all the emotional issues behind family dominance and safety. So we have an enormous challenge now that the community of queer friends is facing profound transformation by queer pro-family ideology, an ideology that constructs the fact that people are related as a central legal and social structure of protection in which outsiders are a threat. This is the very same construction that victimized many of us in fundamental ways in relationship to our own families, lest we forget. The pro-family politic in the queer community has overwhelmed a lot of things that we once understood but no longer remember. Childcare is privatized instead of collectivized. Our understandings about the consumerism of privatized living are forgotten. We've lost a lot of imaginative ground and also emotional complexity in how we talk about and understand relationships. Most importantly, ideas about perfect parents, ideal children, and storybook romance do great harm to many of us. In the construction of motherhood, the idea of what a good mother is, the model of self-sacrifice, predominates. Queering the family has not changed the principal expectation of mothers as martyrs. What emotional rights do queer mothers have in the face of adult children, especially adult male children? Are they expected to sacrifice everything forever? How does the earning differential between women and men play out in queer families? What about gay male parents and surrogacy? Hiring women to do childcare? There are all kinds of anxieties, projections, and distorted thinking involved in our concepts of parenting. The fact that it's queer people doing it doesn't make these things less detrimental to family members themselves. And most importantly, queer families must be accountable to the consequences of their dysfunctions on the larger queer community of friends of which they are a part. Now, families and governments have special relationships of enforcement, and they also function on similar insider-outsider models. Certainly when government and families succeed and their members thrive, there is an inherent exclusion of others. Citizens and family members are privileged over others so that citizens and family members thrive at the expense of others. Successful governments rely on the underpaid labor of immigrants, restrict immigration, and often find their wealth in the exploitation of other peoples and economies and ecosystems. Successful governments may depend on war economies, globalized production, and other endeavors that exploit people who are outside of their societies. And successful governments may provide comfortable, subsidized lives to some citizens at the expense of others who are denied opportunity, participation, and voice. Similarly, successful families often operate with the same structure of exploitation and exclusion. How many times have you heard someone say, "I have to work at the nuclear power plant. I have a family to support"? Or some other justification of doing social harm because they have a family, like "I have relatives in Israel," or the always horrible "boys will be boys." Or on the most banal level, people who say, "I'm sorry we had that plan in place for 3 months, but my cousin is coming." Or "I can't come help you or take care of you because my family, ... Inheritance, of course, is one of the most dramatic ways that people with families are rewarded at other people's expense. Wars are fought to maintain family privilege. Racism and class oppression, in a sense, are family-based supremacy systems. Over and over, maintaining privilege for family members at the detriment of non-relatives is normalized. So just as government excludes and punishes non-citizens, families exclude and punish people who don't have families. They thrive by depriving others, and this is so easy to do, it's practically effortless. But if it's even more interesting to look at how bad families and bad governments hurt others. When governments are corrupt, their own citizens suffer. The governments rob the people, or the government itself is under corporate control, or the government itself is a failed machine that can't even serve its own bureaucratic needs. The people suffer, and this can lead to civil society revolt, as we're seeing around the world right now. As the queer community becomes more and more saturated with family values and familial imperatives, we see an increasing privileging of family, even if it is corrupt and detrimental, over the community of friends. And there are political consequences, of course. Clearly, if we had been divided into privatized family units during the AIDS crisis, we never would have been able to organize as effectively as we did. It was the community-based relationship that made the effective social transformations possible. But I'm looking at this also in terms of emotional consequences. The privileging of destructive family relationships by friends is emotionally and psychologically damaging within the entire queer community, just as it is within straight society. Now, I know it's difficult, but in order to address this, we have to incorporate some way of talking realistically and humanely about psychic pain, anxiety, projection, trauma into the ways we understand families. You can't understand family politics if the emotional issues are ignored. I live in a culture, New York City, that is comfortable recognizing the central role of psychic pain in people's behaviors. This may be because New York was the landing point for the pioneer generation of psychoanalysts when they fled fascism. They settled and trained, and as a consequence, learning to think therapeutically is an integrated part of the culture. Part of being an adult in my world is acquiring a relaxed understanding that people may do things because they are depressed or anxious or manic, and we see this acknowledgement as compassionate and realistic. It is loving, caring, and insightful to say that someone has done something cruel or destructive because they're emotionally out of control, or so anxious they can't think things through. To take the time to realize that someone is dissociated rather than selfish, or anxious rather than mean. This generosity of perception is a forgiving kind of recognition, rooted in the acceptance that we're all human and need compassionate, aware assistance from our friends to think things through and calm down instead of acting compulsively. Helping each other calm down is part of our job, because every person needs to be parented. And by that I mean every person needs to be helped, encouraged, supported, to be accountable to themselves and others, to not be threatened by taking other people into account, to not be frightened of difference. If the family is to be the new queer nation state, the thing to be protected no matter how much harm it does, then the people outside of families are the most vulnerable, the ones who will be punished, blamed, silenced, and excluded. Now, the third and final significant category that divides the queer community into those with access to the state and those to be punished is HIV status. We're seeing a trend right now towards HIV criminalization. There are laws in Canada and in the United States and in other places that are newly emerging right now, in which the state is offering HIV-negative people the option of punishing HIV-positive people if they have sex with each other and the positive does not disclose. Previously, when both were in illegality, the only option was to learn how to communicate with each other. But now the state is saying, don't bother, just inform, and we will punish the positive one. HIV criminalization is the perfect manipulation of the politics of being afraid. And then here I talk about the Trayvon Martin case. But feminists take responsibility to dissipate fear. We do not feed it. We are invested in the uncomfortable but humanizing conversations. Slow? That help people shift their positions and build lives of authenticity and depth. Should I wait? We do not gang up on people. We do not shut down humanizing processes, and we do not shun. Feminists know that facing and dealing with problems is the foundation of progressive change. This is true for governments, families, communities, lovers, and friends. Punishment only deepens and defers conflict and anxiety. Repression has never moved people forward. The harder it is punishing others, the more a person looks for equitable solutions. So, in these three arenas, citizenship, government-promoted family, and HIV criminalization, those outside become the new queer, the new threat, the new abject object who we agree to project onto and who is now vulnerable to the state by the queer family who no longer feels threatened by the state and now identifies with the state, by the queer citizen who wants to protect their racial supremacy, by the queer HIV negative who doesn't want responsibility to communicate. So like the state, they feel endangered in part because of this new experience of dominance, the fear or disdain of the other. Feeling threatened is not the same as being threatened. Feelings without justification are a privilege. Only those who shun don't have to justify. The shunning relieves them of the demand to be accountable. It's the people on the receiving end of the punishment who are blamed. And in this way, how a family feels may become more important than the truth. The state feels threatened, the family feels threatened, the queer community feels threatened. They use a rhetoric based in violence when there is no violence. At the same time, so many people in our community are living with real violence, yet they have no apparatus. So the army of lovers is now the army of citizens and families and the HIV negative. Actually, they're at the service of families, the militia for families, and they are at the service of the state, like the real army. The army of lovers is the army, there to save the family, using the rhetoric of threat, fear, and violence. But when is communication the same as violence? I would say never. So what are the implications? We have to adjust the story we tell about who we think we are. For those of us who are openly queer and want to continue with progressive change, we have to rearrange our alignments so that our commitments are from the point of view of the truly endangered, the non-citizen, the occupied, those outside the family, those who are victimized within the family, those who are HIV positive. For those of us who are not queer and yet want a truly liberationist vision, we have to re-challenge our self-concept so that we're not only supporting LGBT behavior that reminds us of ourselves, but that we make room and in fact insist on the full range of human variation without having to be personally replicated or reaffirmed. It's a question of consciousness, of awareness, and as with all anxieties, political and personal, there is a group responsibility to commit to the discomfort of awareness that is essential to justice, necessary to progressive change, and consistently the constant challenge of feminism. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. That's okay. Thanks. Can we talk? So, thank you. Thanks for understanding. I would like to have some discussion with you. Do we have time for that? No? We don't. Professor Carmen says, come on.
Eu acho que ela é conferencista. Ela manda. Eu acho que pelo menos 15 minutos a gente pode dar depois desse silêncio.
What did she say? Okay, 10 minutes. Questions, comments, fights, disagreements. Hands. Professor Carmen. Who's going to translate for me? Oh. Okay. Thank you. Your job.
And when you answer,
Bom, first of all, sorry for this confusion. I think you.
Yeah, speak in Portuguese.
Of course.
Yeah.
But this is just for you. That's why I'm
okay, thank
telling
you.
in English. Bom, eu achei a sua conferência extremamente corajosa e inovadora em algumas propostas. Essa ideia, essa crítica que você faz ao movimento LGBT, eu acho extremamente inovador. Então, eu não tenho uma pergunta exata para fazer, apenas dizer que, se você quiser agora usar o espaço para dizer aquelas novas ideias que estavam fora do texto e que tu não pudesse dizer, então, eu use o espaço para isso e te parabenizar, porque realmente foi uma comunicação bastante surpreendente, até pela ousadia e pela coragem.
Yeah, no, I gave that. I mean, basically the idea is that the gay movement abandoned feminism and went towards nationalism, citizenship, and the family. And that means it's not a progressive movement.
A ideia é que o feminismo, o movimento queer abandonou a ideia de igualdade, passou para uma ideia de nacionalismo e a questão da família e cidadania.
And therefore it's not a progressive movement.
E então ele deixou de ser progressista.
That's the idea.
Essa é a ideia mais.
Any comments? Yeah.
Há tempos atrás, eu não vou saber dizer quando, o movimento homossexual era denominado GLS, gays, lésbicas e simpatizantes. Eu me senti surpresa e decepcionada, de uma certa forma, politicamente, quando o S sumiu da sigla. Os simpatizantes não foram mais colocados. Só tinha no Brasil? A professora está me dizendo aqui que o S só existia no Brasil. Mas, de qualquer maneira, eu me lembro de discutir isso com uma liderança numa certa situação social, dizendo que o que aconteceu com os simpatizantes? Eles não são mais necessários? Por que a divisão, novamente, nós e eles? Nós, gays, lésbicas, transgêneros, transexuais e os outros. E não mais a uma sigla que falava de algo que nos colocava em comum. Em comum em termos de atitude, de posicionamento.
I'm not familiar with that. That's my answer.
O caso dos simpatizantes é só na sigla antiga brasileira, então não tem resposta no contexto americano.
Yes? Oh, no?
No, that's
Oh, yeah.
sign language.
Right. Philippe?
Eu vou falar em português e depois eu vou falar em inglês para garantir. Não? Tá. Então eu vou ficar aqui bem pertinho para escutar. Sou Ivens, eu sou da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. Eu sou antropólogo e ativista também. Em várias questões eu concordo muito como você explicou tudo isso, pela ótica LGBT. E eu fico refletindo, dentro do meu ativismo e como feminista, se isso também às vezes não acontece um pouco dentro do movimento feminista. E aí, a minha pergunta é assim, quais seriam as maneiras como a gente poderia pensar de conectar mais todos esses movimentos? Porque além do movimento feminista, eu integro também o movimento de direitos sexuais e reprodutivos. E também o movimento LGBT. E eu vejo que cada dia mais a gente se coloca em várias caixas e a gente fala, não podemos colocar. Mas a hora que você, por exemplo, homem, branco, não heterossexual, tento falar em vários outros espaços, existe muita dificuldade. E aí, novamente, a gente recoloca todas as barreiras. E aí eu acho que, do mesmo modo como o movimento gay, que eu nem poderia dizer LGBT, porque ainda existe uma predominância gay fortíssima, como você apresentou, Mas eu acho que em outros movimentos e dentro dos movimentos feministas também acontece isso. E aí eu queria saber qual que seria a sua perspectiva de como a gente poderia pensar maneiras de overcome, de superar isso. Obrigado.
It's not really what I'm talking about right now.
Esse não é o tópico da palestra agora, mas...
Okay. No, it's okay. That's fine. Thank you for your comment. Okay. Thank you for your comment.
Agradecendo o comentário.
Yeah.
Ok. Oi. Posso? Duas questões. Eu estou bastante instigada com a fala. A primeira é a seguinte. Eu compreendi um pouco da crítica no sentido de que o movimento, vou usar LGBT porque a gente usa LGBT aqui no Brasil, saiu da perspectiva da igualdade para uma perspectiva nacionalista, Estado-nação. Será que nós teríamos condições hoje de retomar uma perspectiva da igualdade, ou será que não seria também um equívoco se nós compararmos um pouco com a história do movimento feminista, né, dos embates, da perspectiva do feminismo da igualdade, feminismo da diferença, né, se nós não incorreríamos, de repente, também num problema, né, de não ter coalizão dentro, né, desse grupo, não que eu acredite que seja possível ter uma unissonidade. Uma outra questão, não sei, Sarah, mas o Brasil tem uma política pública LGBT que está sendo exportado para fora, né, com grandes impactos na política externa do Brasil. O Brasil como um país muito receptivo, né, à população, à comunidade LGBT, por ter uma política pública que defenda, né, ou que trate dos interesses dessa política. Nós aqui no Brasil não conseguimos ver a efetivação dessa política, né? Sentimos na pele e na carne a morte de muitas pessoas LGBT, né? Mas fora daqui a gente tem sido visto como um país super friendly, né? Então a minha questão, assim, que instigou e vinha conversando um pouco com o Felipe e Mariana, né, quantas pessoas e quantos grupos dentro do próprio Brasil, mulheres negras, indígenas, populações pobres, né, nós não estamos deixando, ou enfim, matando, ou sendo, vamos dizer, estou tentando lembrar da nossa palavra, Felipe. Então, a gente não está deixando, né, de cuidar, para usar o termo que tu está usando, em prol de uma política que nos defenda e que nos coloque em satisfação com o Estado, né, correspondente à ideia do Estado-nação.
Ok.
Bom, eu queria saber, eu só que gostaria de que, se mais alguém quer intervir, que fizesse rapidamente, viesse, nós vamos encerrar. Então, tem mais uma pessoa inscrita, nós encerramos aqui, e a professora sai. Então, peço que você também faça a sua pergunta, para a professora Sarah poder responder as duas juntas, uma vez que não estava previsto o debate, e a gente tem que encerrar aqui.
Boa noite. Então, você falou muito da cooptação dos sujeitos, dos indivíduos e acho que dos ideais. E a gente vive uma coisa no Brasil, não sei se nos Estados Unidos também, que é a cooptação direta de movimentos sociais, em particular a LGBT, mas não só, por linhas de financiamento público, né? Editais, bolsas de pesquisa, projetos financiados pelo governo. Então, o movimento passa a ser parte direta, um equipamento do Estado. Queria saber se tem essa realidade nos Estados Unidos e como vocês têm lidado e enfrentado com isso.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Agradecendo a todo mundo.
We can talk all night, but we're not going to.
Não vai dar para conversar a noite inteira.
I think, we have to say what kind of world do we really want to live in, right?
A pergunta de verdade é saber em que tipo de mundo a gente quer viver.
Right now we're just in a machine. We're in the gay rights machine.
A gente agora está inserido na máquina dos direitos gays.
And it's a globalized machine.
E essa máquina está globalizada.
And you know, you have to stop the apparatus.
A ideia é parar as máquinas.
And ask yourself, what kind of world do you want?
E a gente precisa se perguntar em que tipo de mundo.
Why are we doing this? Are we doing this so that gay people can join racist anti-immigrant movements as openly gay? No. That's not why I'm here.
Então, o que a gente quer? A gente quer que a comunidade LGBT possa se declarar abertamente gay para participar de movimentos racistas e nacionalistas? Não é isso que ela veio fazer aqui.
Are we doing this so that every woman is going to get married and grow up to be a mother and take care of her children who are all going to be queer? No, that's not the point. Right? So it's time to stop and open our hearts, open our minds and say, what really do we want?
Então, o outro exemplo era sobre crescer e criar famílias que vão ser totalmente queer, e casar e cuidar de crianças desse tipo, que também não é o ponto da nossa conversa agora. E a ideia... A ideia é abrirmos as nossas mentes, os nossos corações, para parar por um momento e a gente precisa se perguntar o que a gente quer.
Thank you.
Obrigada.
Thank you so much.
Eu queria mais uma vez agradecer a professora Sarah, agradecer a Meg, nossa tradutora, nosso tradutor também de Libras, que estiveram aqui, pedir para a professora Luzinete voltar aqui para a plateia, para o palco, saindo da plateia, para a gente poder encerrar, né, a nossa sessão. Professora Luzinete, por favor.
Bom, para encerrar nossos trabalhos nesta sessão, eu convido a professora Cristina Scheib-Wolf e a professora Miriam para darem alguns avisos cruciais para pensar futuros eventos, planejamentos, articulações.
Bom, enquanto a Cristina vai subindo, a gente só queria anunciar, né, que o próximo Fazendo Gênero será...
Bom, gente, na verdade o que a gente quer anunciar é que em 2017 nós iremos fazer aqui em Florianópolis não só o Fazendo Gênero, mas também, junto com o Fazendo Gênero 11, nós faremos o Mundos de Mulheres, Women's World, número 13, se eu não me engano. Então, depois, o próximo Women's World vai ser na Índia, né, como a Rekha Pandey nos anunciou, em 2014, e em 2017 nós teremos esse Congresso Mundial de Mulheres aqui em Florianópolis, e nós pretendemos que ele seja feito junto, num mesmo movimento com o Fazendo Gênero 11.
A gente quer lembrar que o mundo das mulheres, ele de alguma forma vai tentar atender uma demanda grande que nós recebemos nesse encontro, que foi justamente a articulação, uma maior integração do campo acadêmico com o campo ativista, militante, das ONGs, dos movimentos sociais, que é o objetivo do mundo de mulheres, que não haja separação, diferença entre esses dois campos de conhecimento. E como isso só vai ser daqui 4 anos, a gente gostaria muito de estimular, de convidar todas vocês para que façam muitos eventos de gênero, sexualidade, questões queer, em todos os lugares do Brasil. Nós teremos o maior prazer de compartilhar o nosso saber, o nosso conhecimento sobre organizar eventos e visitar vocês também nos eventos que vão organizar que para nós são muito importantes do campo de estudo de gênero e sexualidade.
Só para terminar, a gente então está pensando que não é que vai ficar 4 anos sem Fazendo Gênero, mas que o Fazendo Gênero ele vai se transformar numa espécie de projeto permanente de uma série e que nós vamos estar participando de uma série de eventos que vão ser organizados em várias áreas. A gente vai ter, por exemplo, no ano que vem aqui o segundo colóquio internacional Gênero, Feminismos e Ditaduras no Cone Sul, e isso vai estar ligado com o projeto Fazendo Gênero. A gente vai, né? Ou seja, em 2015 nós temos outros eventos, em 2016 outros eventos, além dos eventos que vocês vão organizar em outras universidades.
Nós também organizamos aqui todo ano, em outubro, o Trans Day. Esse ano será o 4º Trans Day, todo mundo está convidado também. Bom, eu acho que é isso. Queríamos, então, convidar quem ainda sobrou, se é que sobrou, das participantes, se quiserem, uma última salva de palmas às colegas aqui que organizaram esse nosso Fazendo Gênero.